Welcome back. And now for the news in detail. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence says Washington and Ankara have agreed to a ceasefire in northern Syria. Speaking to media, Pence said Turkey will pause its operation for 5 days to allow withdrawal of the Kurdish forces. After meeting Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan, Pence said U.S. will facilitate orderly withdrawal of the YPG forces from a 32-kilometer safe zone area. The vice president said the U.S. will withdraw existing sanctions against Ankara once the military operation ends. He said Turkey and U.S. will work together to implement the agreement. Turkey's Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu said Ankara is suspending its offensive until Kurdish militants withdraw from the area. European Union leaders have unanimously endorsed a Brexit deal, formally sending it to British Parliament for ratification. The new withdrawal agreement was struck on Thursday after days of intense negotiations between London and Brussels. Details in this report.
After the European leaders' approval, the Brexit draft will now go to the British Parliament for ratification. European Council President Donald Tusk says the bloc's doors will be open if UK decides to return one day. Tusk said the new deal will ensure integrity of single market. He said the deal has been positively assessed by Ireland.
The new version of the deal has been positively assessed by Ireland. I've said from the beginning that we would always stand behind Ireland and not force a deal unfavourable to Dublin.
EU leaders at the summit in Brussels backed the agreement. The head of the EU executive, Jean-Claude Juncker, says the deal will maintain peace on the island of Ireland.
What we have agreed on is much more than a deal. It's a legal text which provides legal certainty to the problems created by Brexit.
The new deal involves checks on the Irish Sea to avoid a physical border on the island of Ireland. There will be checks at major ports such as Liverpool, Belfast and Holyhead.
In Brussels, EU leaders have failed to reach agreement on allowing Albania and North Macedonia to start talks to join the bloc. The deadlock comes days after EU ministers hit a similar impasse at talks in Luxembourg. Senior EU leaders and all member states except France believe North Macedonia has made sufficient efforts for talks to start. Albania, by contrast, has less support. The Netherlands, Denmark and France have voiced serious reservations about the progress it has made on reforms. Russia has called on BRICS partners to minimize the risk of conflict and ensure stability in the nuclear rocket sphere. At a meeting of the group in Brasilia, Russian Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev said Moscow rejects all unilateral sanctions. Patrushev noted the importance of adapting the system of international security to new conditions. Patrushev said BRICS countries are at the forefront of countering growing threats for the international community. Patrushev also said Russia is enhancing cooperation with Brazil in its fight against terrorism, drug trafficking and transnational crime. He said Russia will carry on constructive dialogue with Brazil on a bilateral basis and in multilateral formats. Almost 100 people have been injured after police fired rubber-coated bullets at protesters demanding freedom and release of jailed leaders. Catalan separatists burned police barricades in Barcelona and other cities. Tossing Molotov cocktails at police, hundreds of protesters set roadblocks and rubbish containers on fire in Barcelona. Rescue services said 58 people have been injured in Barcelona, while another 38 sustained injuries in Catalan cities. Police in Catalonia have detained 97 protesters since Monday. Protests were triggered after a court jailed 9 of their leaders over a failed independence bid in 2017. U.S. President Donald Trump will host next year's Group of 7 economic summit at one of his golf clubs in Florida. Trump offered to host the next summit at his private golf resort during this year's G7 summit in France in August. White House Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney said the summit will take place from the 10th to 12th of June 2020. He said climate change will not be on the agenda of the summit. Two Palestinians have been wounded after Israeli forces fired rubber bullets on unarmed protesters in Ramallah city. Palestinians have taken to the streets in protest against the Israeli establishment of a new settlement outpost on Turmus Aya land. Israeli occupation forces fired rubber bullets after failing to disperse protesters with tear gas. Meanwhile, Israeli forces have detained 9 Palestinians during multiple overnight raids across the West Bank. None of the soldiers were injured in the collision. Israeli forces used to conduct such raids in areas under full control of the Palestinian Authority. Palestinians live in fear as Israeli forces could bomb them at any time under the guise of fighting terrorism. One child survivor of an Israeli airstrike on Gaza 5 years ago dreams of having superpowers. It's his way of coping with the trauma of living under Israeli occupation. Details in this report.
Israel's war crimes in Palestinian territory have taken a lot from thousands of children, but the survivors' stories don't finish with bombs and bullets. Yamin, just 3 years old at the time, and his baby sister survived. His back is still scarred and his left forearm remains deformed. The caretaker of both children still remembers the horrible incident.
On 29th July 2014, a massacre of my husband's family occurred. The massacre took the lives of 18 people, mostly women and children, especially 8 children. Only 2, Gaina and Yamin, emerged from the rubble that day.
But Yamin still has hope for the future and wants to be a policeman or even a superhero like Spider-Man.
I want to play ball, or when I grow up, I want to become a policeman. I wish I were Spider-Man and I had superpowers.
Founder of the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, Raji Sourani has demanded Israel to open a war crimes investigation into the incident. But after 5 years, he still has not got any answer.
We asked them to investigate about the war crime and to find out what had happened. And it's our right, it's the right of the victims or their relatives, or even Yamin, this young boy, to know why he lost 19 of his family members, including his father and mother.
Israel is still committing war crimes in Palestinian territories. Meanwhile, Jewish settlements in the West Bank and land seizures are making the two-state solution into a distant dream.
2 foreign workers in Lebanon have choked to death from smoke during the ongoing protests against the government taxes. Dense smoke engulfed the demonstration site after a symbolic fire spread to a building near the major protests in capital Beirut. State media says the death toll could rise as rescuers are trying to pull the bodies out and douse the blaze. Thousands have taken to the streets across Lebanon against the government's plans to impose new taxes amid an economic crisis. Police fired tear gas and protesters blocked the roads, prompting heavy deployment of security forces. In Yemen, the United Nations says that 388 civilians have been killed or injured due to the conflict in September. It said this has been the deadliest month for civilians so far this year. During a Security Council meeting, UN Humanitarian Chief Mark Lowcock said only 250 agencies are working for over 12 million people stuck in the deadly war. He called for a nationwide ceasefire under international humanitarian law to protect the civilians. Last week, airstrikes destroyed a UN-supported water system that provided for 12,000 people. The UN says more civilians were killed in Afghanistan during the past quarter than any other 3-month period since the start of the war. In a report, the UN assistance mission in Afghanistan said over 1,100 civilians were killed from July to September. A UN report said over 2,500 civilians were killed and over 5,500 wounded so far this year. The report says US-led coalition and Afghan security forces are responsible for 62% of the casualties. Calling for the violence totally unacceptable, UN's Afghan envoy Tadamichi Yamamoto stressed on the need for an immediate ceasefire. Bangladeshi forces have killed an Indian guard in a border clash. India's border security force said another soldier was wounded in cross-border fighting. It said the clash happened after Bangladeshi forces detained 3 Indian fishermen. 2 of 3 fishermen were later released. Moving on to Mexico, where heavily armed fighters have freed drug lord Joaquim El Chapo Guzman's son after a dramatic gunfight with the National Guard. Mexico's Security Minister Alfonso Durazo said National Guard patrol came under attack from within a house in the city. Durazo said gangsters had set up roadblocks and were unleashing heavy automatic gunfire. Police were successful in detaining Guzman, but the decision was withdrawn to restore calm in the city. El Chapo led the Sinaloa cartel for decades, escaping from prison twice before being arrested and extradited to the U.S. New Zealand will start armed police patrols in the parts of the country to prevent attacks like Christchurch shooting. Police Commissioner said the mosque attack in March that killed 51 Muslim worshippers has changed the operating environment. Bush said police must ensure that people are enabled to practice their religion without fear. He said the armed response teams will roll out in Auckland, Waikato and Canterbury on October the 28th on a 6-month trial. They will be routinely armed, equipped and ready to support frontline police officers at incidents that require enhanced tactical capabilities. The police commissioner said that there was no immediate threat. More stories to follow right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta has expressed gratitude to China for assistance in building a railway line linking Nairobi to the town of Naivasha. The project was part of the One Belt, One Road initiative, upgrading trade routes between Asia, Africa and China. This report has more.
Waving the Kenyan flag, President Uhuru Kenyatta inaugurated the country's new railway line. Trains stopped at every station where a cheering crowd awaited the president. He promised his people that the new railway will bring prosperity to their country. Thanking China at the launch ceremony, Kenyatta called the Chinese true friends of Kenya.
The People's Republic of China, their various development partners and China Road and Bridge Cooperation. I want to thank them for being true friends of Kenya's growth and development agenda.
The railway line is expected to ease congestion at the Nairobi-Naivasha highway, as well as boost regional trade and the local economy.
It cuts down on the travel time. The second one is the mass transport. You're able to move many people at the same time. Again, it will open up Naivasha for purposes of especially industrial.
China is also working on the second phase of the project, which will eventually link Nairobi and the Uganda border.
In the U.S., teachers are out on the streets rather than tending to their classrooms in the third largest Chicago state. These nearly 33,000 teachers all have legitimate concerns. Find out more in this report.
Thousands of teachers and staff walked off their school jobs, cancelling classes for 300,000 students. At the heart of the dispute is class sizes and resources rather than pay. Teachers say they want more social workers, nurses, and librarians for their students.
Throughout the entire city, there's inequality. And there are schools that don't have librarians, don't have a nurse, don't have a social worker, and we have trauma in this city. We have kids that need supports, and we're a first world country, and we have the resources, but we're not allocating them in the right way.
They also believe they don't have sufficient time to prepare teaching materials and should not have to take on more than one task.
I'd rather just get smaller classroom size, and the money is not the issue here. For me and a lot of the teachers, that's why we're here. It's just, what we need to make our schools better. The supplies that we don't get, we're spending our own money. More and more every year, you're spending your own money, get less and less.
The Chicago Public Schools District, which had been dealing with a budget crisis, was recently buoyed by significant new state funding of $1.9 billion. The union says the cash has resolved the district's structural deficit, but still carries a shortage of $8.4 billion.
On the north coast of South America, Greenpeace's research ship is on a mission to explore a new marine biome off the coast of Guyana. A team of French scientists have been working to identify the Amazon reef's diverse marine life, as well as making a case to keep the area from fossil fuel foragers. This report will tell you more.
Off the coast of French Guyana lies one of the world's largest coral reefs, only recently discovered. The Esperanza, part of Greenpeace's fleet, has come to explore this unique and extensive ecosystem. On board, scientists scan the waves from sunrise to sunset. They carefully record all the species they sight in this area rich with marine life.
We have an idea of how many species we have, of the diversity, but we have very little information on their habits, their migrations.
Biologists spot a school of whales in the middle of a hunt, and within minutes the Zodiac is being launched under the watchful eye of the captain. Between the tuna and sharks, scientists observe the bride's whale for the first time in this area. A rare species, they grow up to 16 meters long. This is proof for these naturalists that the area is far from being an oceanic desert.
If they feed here, it is because they are important areas for the survival of species. So inevitably, if there are too many disturbances, they will have to leave these areas, and it is not easy for them to find the same conditions in other areas.
The word survival might sound strong, but the threat from fossil fuel foragers is very real. It's not just the reef which would suffer in the event of an oil spill. On land, mangrove forests stretch all along Guyana's coast, serving as crucial fish nurseries as well as absorbing carbon from the atmosphere.
In case of oil pollution, we could see oil pellets entering this mangrove. Bear in mind that this mangrove is still the breeding location for our fish.
For Guyanese fishermen, fossil fuel companies represent a chance to renew their obsolete equipment. From its oceans to its forests, Guyana is rich in natural resources, but the questions of whether they should be exploited divides opinion in the capital, Cayenne. The fragility of the Amazon reef underlines the urgency of reaching an international agreement. Experts on board Esperanza hope their findings will convince decision makers to sign an ambitious treaty to protect the oceans.
The US has imposed tariffs on a record $7.5 billion worth of European goods. Washington imposed the duties despite France's warning it will retaliate. The duties were levied after the US won a landmark case at the WTO over EU's unfair subsidies to Airbus. In the line of fire are civilian aircraft from Britain, France, Germany and Spain. But the tariffs also target consumer products like French and Scottish alcoholic beverages. France's Economy Minister Bruno Le Maire said the tariffs will have very negative consequences both from an economic and political point of view. Facebook's plans to launch its Libra cryptocurrency faced a new hurdle at joint annual meeting of the World Bank and IMF. The G7 nations said such stablecoins should not be allowed to launch until the profound international risks they pose are addressed. Apart from this, a number of key issues were discussed, such as trade and sustainable development. On the sidelines, the IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said she's encouraged by news of a tentative trade deal reached by Washington and Beijing. The annual meeting brings together finance and political leaders from all over the world. Asia-Pacific markets have traded low as China released slowest GDP figures after its protracted trade conflict with the US. Less than expected, China's economy grew 6% in the third quarter, which negatively hit the markets. Mainland Chinese markets fell after the release of the data, with both Shanghai Composite and Shenzhen Component going down. Hong Kong's Hang Seng and South Korea's Kospi have also dropped. Going against the trend, Japan's Nikkei 225 has risen 0.17%. Decline in shares of National Australia Bank has also dropped ASX 200. And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. Thank you for watching. Further updates, stay tuned with Indus.